Eswatini government wants to close the editors' forum in that country. It follows an altercation between the Prime Minister, Russell Dlamini, and journalists. Government is now accusing the editor of The Nation magazine, Bheki Makhubu, of a verbal attack. There's also a move now to redesign how the public will be informed about government business. Let's unpack the story further. We're joined this afternoon by Nkanyiso Mtolo, who's the regional campaign manager for Amnesty International. Nkanyiso, it's great to have you on. Thanks very much indeed for joining us. And I suppose the beginning of the story is, how do we understand the relationship between government and the media just outside of this incident that we're talking about? But to what extent does Eswatini have free media, and to what extent can that media operate without fear or favor?
Well, thank you, Michelle. Thank you so much for having this afternoon. Well, Eswatini's media landscape is heavily repressive, with journalists operating under, a constant climate of fear, where they face, severe restrictions, harassment, and even violence. The government has periodically used harsh laws like the Sedition and Subversive Activities Act, and more recently the Suppression of Terrorism Act, which we may talk to as we go on. But this particular legislation has been used to target those who speak out against government. Now, quite recently, the Supreme Court of Eswatini upheld this particular act, which gives authorities, even more power to label journalism and peaceful activism as terrorism.
So even taking a look at how this incident was described between the senior journalist at the Editors' Forum and the Prime Minister Russell Dlamini, it's being described as a verbal showdown. How trustworthy is even that description?
Well, look, and this goes down to really the bulk of our contestation with how the government of Eswatini has been able to interface with civil and political rights, particularly with the rights such as the freedom of association and the freedom of expression, particularly using this particular legislation that we spoke about, the Suppression of Terrorism Act, which gives government a huge role in determining what types of activities, what types of comments, what types of settings can activists, human rights defenders, associate themselves to. Now, as Amnesty International, we are deeply concerned about not only the utterances of the Prime Minister, but also these forms of legislations that have been repeatedly used to suppress freedom of expression, association, and assembly in this country. I mean, we can point out to the recent case of journalist and editor Zoe Dlamini, who in 2020 had to flee from Eswatini to South Africa. And this came after he faced severe threats by government over the articles that he had published on his media publication. He now faces a legal challenge by the government in South Africa, in Mpumalanga, where the government is suing him for defamation. So this is generally a culture that we are observing that is repeated, but is emboldened by such repressive laws, which we and other organizations such as Human Rights Watch, the African Commission last year recently called that these practices, including these legislation, have to be really reviewed.
Yeah, and it must be noted as well, Nkanyiso, that Bheki Makhubu, the editor of The Nation magazine, he's also no stranger to this kind of interaction with government, right? In fact, it was in 2014 that he and another person, the late human rights defender Thulani Maseko, were jailed also in connection with separate articles that they had written. In fact, Makhubu spending more than a year in prison.
Yes, that's right. So that challenge is a challenge that that activists like Makhubu, Thulani Maseko, the Masugus, the founders and president of Pudemo took the government of Eswatini to court to review this piece of legislation that I've spoken about. One, on the fact that one, it's one vague. Two, that it's overreaching. And three, that it obviously is a serious threat to not only fundamental rights in eSwatini, but breaches international international obligation.
Right.
Now, the issue with this act began with the definition of what it states as terrorism, which is one dangerously broad. It includes acts such as, nothing to do with terrorism, such as holding a peaceful protest or simply speaking out against the government. This broad language has often given authorities the power to label any form of dissenter as a terrorist. And this is a huge threat to civil society organizations. In reality, the law is actually not about countering terrorism. It really is about targeting freedom of expression, like freedoms of expression exercised by journalists like Makubu, which we as Amnesty International call for its repeal.
I mean, the one government official has now issued a statement saying that to protect the office of the Prime Minister, government has taken a decision to redesign how the public will be informed about government business and issues of national importance going forward. What does that mean?
Again, it points out to the very arbitrary context in which one, freedom of expression, freedom of association, freedom of assembly can be exercised in eSwatini, which is one, confined, repressive, where government uses really arbitrary acts to overreach into these particular areas of, really fundamental rights. But this goes back to what we as Amnesty have consistently called for not only in eSwatini, but in SADC, that media is crucial for promoting transparency and ensuring accountability and protecting human rights. How it serves as a watchdog for exposing government abuses and informing citizens about their rights. However, in eSwatini, the media suppression has dire consequences.
Sure, and it's easy to see that in a country if you compare, South Africa, for example, where journalists have been at the forefront, for example, of unveiling issues of state capture and corruption. The risk of not having a free press, it ultimately means that there is no accountability, or the accountability factor for government is greatly diminished.
Absolutely. And I mean, just look at the recent and tragic case of, human rights lawyer and defender, Thulani Maseko, who one is a great, a human rights lawyer, but a critic of government. Last year he was assassinated. And despite, calls from organizations such as us, organizations within in eSwatini, the investigation into the implication to his death, the government has remained silent. That is a cost of speaking out. That's the cost of freedom of expression within such a repressive environment. And of course, South Africa stands as a beacon with its, really wide and open and protective human rights mechanisms, but also mechanisms that strengthen freedom of expression. And we hope that eSwatini could, one, copy, but also really respond by acknowledging that it has the obligations to ensure that freedom of expression and assembly is protected.
Yeah, where would we be without freedom of expression and a free press? Nkanyiso Mtolo, let me thank you for your time this afternoon. He's the Regional Campaign Manager for Amnesty International.